Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's Rob Sedaghatpour from STRATCO Property Solutions. Today's webinar is on building energy benchmarking. We called it Energy Benchmarking 101. I'm here with my good friend, Dan Overbey. I'll let Dan give a quick intro on his background and his expertise in this space. Dan, go ahead.
Thanks, Rob, and happy to be here and to talk with everyone. I'm an educator at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and I'm also the Director of Sustainability with Browning Day, which is an architecture firm located in Indianapolis.
So for those that don't know STRATCO, we're a solutions provider for New York City multifamily. We advise on energy efficiency, sustainability, and rent regulatory matters. So let's start with giving a point of context on, Dan, what is benchmarking? How is it relevant for energy consumption?
So the term of benchmarking within the context of building operations is a practice of essentially starting to measure certain performance qualities of our projects. And namely, we do this with operational energy and water consumption. There's an old adage that you can't improve what you don't measure. So the practice of benchmarking really begins with measuring and starting to track in a very intentional way how your property how it has been historically consuming water and energy. And when you start to collect that information, it starts to inform you as to how your project is performing. You can then start to understand the performance of that project relative to other comparable properties. And you can then start to open the door toward looking at measures that can improve the performance of your project. And on that, you have varying degrees of potential improvement. So it opens up the door toward a path to improve the water or energy use of your facility.
So towards the end of this presentation, we'll discuss EUI, which is an index, a summary index on qualifying how your building's performing. I'll let Dan provide that explanation later on. So role of benchmarking, we want to outline basically how we're performing versus the best in class or the median. So as Dan mentioned earlier, it's, if you can't measure it, you can't own it, you can't outline a path forward. And through data comes knowledge, through knowledge comes power. And from the experience with my clients on our advisory level, it's through this power we're able to create a competitive advantage for our customers. And those that get ahead and able to focus on this, the data that we're producing, oftentimes with some level of commitment and expertise, we're able to create a competitive advantage for those buildings. Dan, anything you want to add here?
I think just that what we're seeing here is you're essentially able to, when you start to measure the performance of your facility and you see it within a context, that can provide very powerful information about where your standing is in the marketplace. There are factors to consider from the standpoint of real estate in that regard as well. This is a whole new consideration in terms of property management when you are in a municipality or a jurisdiction that requires you to benchmark, and they will publicly disclose that information. So it's really important. This is really where there's tremendous value, is understanding your facility or your property within the context of comparable properties.
So let's give an example. For example, we could take a build, in our own office, we could take any one of our buildings and do a benchmarking analysis with a few thousand buildings of the same size, description, square footage, and see how they're performing on their common area lights, their water consumption on a per square foot or per unit basis. And this helps outline, areas of opportunity on improving both the decreasing consumption and improving, their performance on their operating expenses. So while we're talking about, how we can improve maybe our bottom line, let's talk about the, how this relates to a regulatory or local law compliance. So specifically for New York City, you have to benchmark for buildings greater than 25,000 square feet. Some of the benefits of doing this, some of the best benefits for New York City is they're able to get an in-depth understanding of their building stock. From this data, they're able to create effective rulemaking, compliance measures, or future policy. And for those owners that are focused on this, or systematically, they're able to improve their energy performance on these buildings. Dan, can you outline from a regulatory perspective why cities, states, or any type of municipality may embark on a benchmarking local law?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Rob. So when a city considers, or even in some cases, there's a few states that have been considering benchmarking ordinances, and this is in order to align with perhaps that jurisdiction's goals with regard to perhaps something like carbon emissions, some of the associated carbon emissions based on the grid and some other factors. It's really, though, in its purest form. There's a lot of other ways in which it can align with broader municipal or jurisdictional goals, but rather than require in more of a regulatory, more heavy-handed regulatory manner, what you should do or what you need to accomplish with regard to operational energy, associated carbon, water consumption, et cetera. It puts the market mechanisms in play by that disclosure. Typically, it's not just the reporting of your property's energy use data, and in some cases water, but it's also in the reporting of that, in the public disclosure of that. And New York City is one of the prime examples of this. The benchmarking ordinance has been in place for over a decade, and there's a nonprofit, Urban Green, that has issued a report just a few months ago that actually looks at that decade of the benchmarking ordinance being in effect and what that has yielded. And what we've seen is, when you understand that relative to comparable real estate assets, your project is performing in the upper 25 percentile or maybe the lower 25 percentile, it may influence the degree to which property owners invest in their facilities to improve operations. It does create some market mechanisms that are now put in place to motivate property owners to invest in measures that can improve that, especially when that information is being disclosed to the public. So it's a really interesting resource to look at. I'd encourage anybody to just pull down that report if you're curious, and you can see that the aggregate effect of having the benchmarking ordinance in place for a decade has turned into really widespread and pretty substantial impacts for New York City and other cities that have implemented such policies.
So that was from a government perspective, but let's say, for example, the private owner or the operating company that has multiple assets. How can you benefit from this? You can develop an understanding of what your starting point is, of how you're performing to date. With that data, you can create a formal process of how to track and monitor your consumption. You may not be aware of some overages or some mismanaged areas, or, for example, leaks with water. With this, you can also identify opportunities to reduce energy and, most importantly, operating costs. And it's really a data-driven process for continuous improvement. And as technology continues to advance and costs continue to compress, the payback on these types of potential improvements are oftentimes very high.
So Rob, that's a really great point. And I would just offer that from my perspective as an architect. We sometimes, when we're having discussions with clients about certain measures we might implement on an existing property to try to improve energy performance, we may have a sense, kind of a working sense of what could work and what may not, what benchmarking can do, and especially when combined with some of the performance modeling tools we have now as well, is you're right, it'll be a very evidentiary based, data driven approach to looking at various energy conservation measures, and you can start to prioritize, get the most bang for the buck in terms of reducing energy cost, reducing the operational cost. And that's one of the great values of it. And it again gets back to starting with really having an understanding for not just how your property performs, but relative to other properties, how it's performing, and then where you can invest and have the most impact. So that's a great point you bring up.
So let's outline, how do we comply with the New York City local law? So one, start early, don't save it to the last minute. Two, you can, for someone that wants to do it on their own, you can use a government portal. It's called the EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager to upload the data. You're not limited to using an outside professional. You have to submit by May 1st. What happens if you don't? And you may run the most efficient building in New York City, you're still going to get an F for not submitting it on time. You can also get a fine. You also need to, you have to give yourself a window period to, basically a margin of safety for updates to be posted on the portal, because you're linking information from your utility accounts. It needs several days to sync. So it won't happen right when you're planning on submitting it. And then most importantly, after you upload everything towards the end of the year, in the month of October, you're going to be posting your letter grade on your building. So Dan, we can literally anything can be benchmarked. We're talking about, for, buildings itself, I'm specifically talking about buildings greater than 25,000 square feet. What are the benefits of using a benchmarking or an energy monitoring software versus just going through the local law compliance? What are we gonna gain? I outlined a few things here, but I'd like you to give us like a few examples of how is the end user going to benefit from maybe benchmarking a building that's smaller, their personal house, their office space. So a few things that I have here is, one, what are the differences? Anything can be benchmarked. There's no deadline for benchmarking your own space. We're benchmarking the same things as far as water. If you go, for example, with the software that we use, we can customize it to compare literally anything, either on a per square foot basis, on a daily basis. We're able to outline spikes. And for example, if we're installing a new boiler, we can outline the performance of that boiler versus the previous boiler. Dan, can you elaborate here on your I guess, cost benefit on having benchmarking done on things that are maybe outside of the local law compliance?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rob. So there's technology available now to meter and sub-meter our properties, and we do this very commonly now on the commercial side. But even on the residential side, there are a number of energy consumption meters you can get for the residential scenario. There's several in the marketplace now. They're usually a couple $100. You have an electrician install it. And so two different ways in which we're getting information here. So there's the monthly record of how much energy your property may use or your house may use. But when you have that real-time feedback loop, then you can start to understand. You could build two structures immediately adjacent to each other, and same specs, same documents, and they will still perform differently. There was a Lawrence Berkeley study several years ago that showed that 9 out of 10 commercial properties had some kind of problem in the first year of operation due to their mechanical systems. It could be something like something wasn't programmed properly. There was actually a mechanical failure. Maybe a damper got stuck. It could be a big thing, could be a small thing, but 9 out of 10, Rob. I have seen situations in houses where a new ACCU is put in, a new condensing unit's put in, and it was installed properly, but it wasn't programmed correctly. When you have that real-time feedback, and as you're saying, you're seeing the performance curves, you start to develop a relationship with your house, with your property, with the energy use profiles, and you can, well, in some utility jurisdictions, there may be a demand charge at different peak hours, but I would say more at the user level and more at the property owner level too. When you understand the sort of unique fingerprint through which your building will consume energy, you can know that residential project, they knew immediately within an hour that something wasn't programmed properly. They're able to go in, make a phone call, remote in, change some things on the smart thermostat, and it was up and running, worked fine. If they didn't have that meter, if they didn't have that real-time feedback, they may have gone on an entire billing cycle before they really caught anything. Same thing on the commercial side is you can determine and pinpoint when there are issues, as opposed to waiting for an entire month, an entire reporting cycle before you start to see things, that you really start to understand at another level of granularity how your properties are performing. So you can see that there's multiple facets to this value proposition. It makes it helps you understand where your building stands relative to comparable properties in the marketplace. By reporting the information, you can start to work with your architects and engineers, your design teams, to develop energy conservation measures and get the most bang for the buck. But then at that more granular level, you start to understand with much more precision now when something may or may not be working right with your property, and you can do something about it. That in and of itself may pay for the one catch early could more than pay for some of the investment in these metering devices and smart devices that give you that feedback.
So to add to that, we have customers that are getting poor letter grades on new construction buildings, and they're saying, well, everything in the building's new. Why am I getting such a poor letter grade? It's because the building's being run as a energy guzzler. It's you may, if we were to compare this with the diet and nutrition for a human being, you may have the highest quality foods, but if your consumption's too high, you're still going to gain weight. Similar here, you may create a beautiful building, it may be brand new, but if you're not monitoring your consumption, and if you're not measuring and verifying how well everything's running, the newness of what you created may not necessarily compensate for its effectiveness.
It's well put.
So, some common mistakes we found with benchmarking is people are not digging into basically the details that they're getting. They're maybe getting it from the property manager, the accounts payable team, or the building staff. But no one, it's coming from all these different sources, but no one necessarily has a pulse on whether all of that's being accurate. You're just doing the data aggregation. So you have to ensure that the information you're getting is accurate. You may be getting utility data shared from your utility provider, but you have to review it and ensure that it's accurate. You've got to make sure that all of your meters are complete and accurate. Many of us go through situations where there's a defective meter in one building in our portfolio, and that can totally throw off your shown energy consumption, and it may not necessarily be accurate. So this beautiful image on the left was created by my colleague here that summarizes to someone that's a non-energy professional, typical index, which is called EUI. You can compare this maybe to body fat index for a human being. Dan, can you give us a high level of what this is illustrating?
I can. So the way that we developed this metric, this energy use intensity metric, is to consider all the different ways in which your property may be consuming energy. And it's really considering it all, the lighting, the hot water, appliance loads, heating and cooling systems. You pull all that together. Now you may have some electricity being used and recorded in terms of kilowatt hours. You may have therms for natural gas. We need to pull together all this information in terms of British thermal units, BTUs. And in fact, you'll have so many of those in many cases that we actually use KBTUs, 1,000 BTUs, as it were. So you take that for the entire year, all 365 days, you take all the ways in which your building uses energy, come up with that total amount of BTUs, and think about it over the course of the year. So divide it out over the course of all 365 days, and then divide it by each square foot of your property. This is really important because it allows a better comparison, a better understanding of what kind of energy footprint your property has. Now, a house is going to have a much lower EUI than let's say a multidisciplinary research classroom building at a university. There's going to be wildly different numbers. So what the Energy Star score then does is it will look at comparable properties. It'll look at all of the, if we're talking about a multifamily project, it'll look at all the multifamily projects in a similar climate zone, in a similar region. If it's talking about an office building or maybe elementary school, it's going to take types of buildings and do an appropriate apt comparison. And then it's going to, when you report it into the portfolio manager, an Energy Star product that Rob was referring to a few slides ago, it's going to give you a percentile number from 1 to 100. So you could have an energy use intensity number. That's the real BTUs per square foot per year. But you need to understand what that number means relative to comparable facilities. Think of it as a percentile. If you're above a score 50 percentile. So when New York City rolled out their energy benchmarking ordinance in that first year, it was amazing. I recall looking at that data, and you saw some properties that had gone through some deep energy retrofits in recent years, big, tall high rises that had achieved Energy Star scores in the that had conducted no measures at all. I won't name the names of some of these properties, but there was one I recall, mid-century modernist structure, had an Energy Star score of 3, Rob. It was a score of 3. So imagine 80 something to 3 something. That's a percentile. That's where you're operating in the marketplace in a comparable way. So that transparency, yes, right there, that's perfect. That number, that Energy Star score number right there, that 75, that's helping you understand what percentile it is. In this case, 75 percentile, you get a grade of a B. I don't know about you, Rob. When I was in elementary school, I had to be in the 80s to get a B, but it's close enough. It still conveys the same idea. It's still a percentile number, 75. That's pretty good, actually. Not very many projects are in those upper percentiles. 75 is solid. That could be a certified Energy Star build score of B there.
So let's outline. So you get an EUI score, then that EUI gets converted into an Energy Star score, which is basically a percentile for the same building class, correct?
Nailed it, yep.
Okay, so that EUI score, you want it to be as low as possible. So you want to have as small of a number as possible for your EUI. You want to put that into the database for the building stock that you're in. That's going to shoot you back an Energy Star score. Correct?
That is correct. And what becomes a little bit maybe not initially intuitive, I mean, if the EUI is the actual amount of energy that the building uses on a per square foot basis, lower number, lower EUI means more efficient, it means less energy being used. On the other hand, your Energy Star score is a percentile. So on that side, from 0 to 100, that you could think of it, that's why they put the letter grade on there. It's because of this confusion. In the case of the Energy Star score, the higher the better, because that's where you are in the percentile. So that's where it gets so it makes it really clear to just give it a letter grade. So the B is like, okay, we can all relate to school. Let's say, there you go, a B, we understand that. So but that 75, that Energy Star score is the percentile number. So that'll always be somewhere between 1 and 100.
So takeaways: start early. Check to make sure you're on the list through New York City DOB. File by May 1st. Consider continuously monitoring your energy consumption. If you're looking for an outside professional to help you, you can reach out to us. This is something that we do regularly. We can help you improve your score. We can give you an understanding of why you got what you got. We can outline rebates and incentives available, which are many, for doing retrofits. We can access financing for doing it and making your building the best in class within that building type. Dan, thanks so much for joining us today. Look forward to doing more seminars on similar energy topics, and good luck, everyone.
Thanks, Rob. Happy to be back anytime. Thanks for the invite here. I'll look forward to being in touch soon.